Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me for another episode in the Conversations with Alan series. I'm Alan Locher. I am the child of two Holocaust survivors and created this series to have honest discussions about the rise of anti Semitism and hate with high hopes that it leads to conversations that make us all think about our own place in shaping history and to inspire collective action to eradicate hate in all its forms. Tonight, I'm honored to welcome a third generation Holocaust descendant, Jeremy Lentz. Jeremy, a passionate storyteller and a fierce advocate, is on a mission to preserve Shauna Blumenfeld Rosenkranz, his grandmother's powerful Holocaust story. Fueled by a desire to prevent her story from fading into silence, Jeremy became a catalyst for change. He wanted the world to hear her story, to understand its profound impact, and to prove to her that people wanted to hear her story. Following her passing, Jeremy recognized his responsibility to make the world acknowledge that the Holocaust did happen and make sure it would not become a distant memory. He is speaking to a new generation with a mission of fostering understanding and awareness at a time when it is clearly needed. Tonight, I hope you'll gain some insight into the lasting impact of these personal stories and discover why understanding the Holocaust is essential in combating hatred and injustice in 2024 and beyond. Please help me welcome Jeremy Lentz to Conversations with Alan. Hey, Jeremy.
Good evening, Alan. So good to be here. Thank you for that great welcome.
Well, thank you so much for your willingness to share your grandmother's story. Will you tell me about your grandmother and your relationship with her?
She was an extraordinary woman. She taught me so much about life, and she had such a passion for living. And I think, as any grandson could attest, a Jewish grandmother, her grandkids were her life. And she certainly made us very aware of that. Growing up, they were in Brooklyn, and I always knew about her story. She was always somebody who was very open about speaking about her life prior to coming to America, but those stories were always in really short segments. So I never got like a linear story from what happened from start to finish. So she would talk about segments and then, just kind of interrupt or interject with something else or completely, go off topic. So I never really knew what the story was fully about. What I did know was I grew up in a world where I was surrounded by survivors. So everybody that was in her world in Brooklyn were all Eastern European Jews who had come out of the Holocaust. And I didn't realize that that was unique until I got much older and I left New York and went away to college. And it was at that time where I really started to understand, especially as my grandmother was getting older, the importance in her story and making sure that it was documented for posterity and for future generations to learn about what happened. So it was at that point where I sat down and I said, you know what, Grandma, I'm like, you're getting older. We need to do something. And I'd like to talk to you about what happened. And she agreed. And that's kind of how.
Was there any hesitation?
Not really. I don't, she didn't hesitate. I think, in a certain way, she was almost surprised that somebody wanted to hear her story or that it had merit or meaning. And so much, I think, was triggered in the 90s when Schindler's List came out and Spielberg was documenting all of the Shoah survivors. So there was this necessity that time is running out and we have to do something to ensure that a generation doesn't become silence. And we need to bear witness and not be mute witnesses. So that's really, I think, where the spark came out. And that led me on this incredible journey. And for me personally, as a teenager, it gave me such a strong sense of self in completing this narrative, in having this piece of this puzzle that I could share with future generations, with my niece, with, you know, my children's, with my sister's family and grandchildren, and all of that to be passed down from generation to generation. So these things are really, really important, and just build so much in terms of knowing who you are and where you came from.
I completely agree, and it was really Schindler's List for me that sparked my greater understanding of what my parents had lived through. And you know, I was taken by what you said about the community in Brooklyn. It never really dawned on me, or never was a thought in my head. But like you, here in New Jersey, all of my relatives really were Holocaust survivors
Mm-hmm.
early on. I mean, a lot of them are gone
Right.
now, but as a young child, that's, you know, they all came over from Holland. So, you know, so interesting. I never thought of that as the larger picture, but what that group of people could have spoken out about if it was easy to speak about, because it
Yeah.
certainly not for everybody. You know, I have somebody still in her 90s, a cousin who is still petrified to speak out about it.
Yeah. You know, it was a very different reaction from my mother, being a
Mm.
second generation. When I told my mom that I was going to do this, she encouraged me and she said it's a good thing that I'm doing it, but she really wanted to be removed from that process because of the pain, I think, that she endured as a child growing up, where my mother, both my grandparents were survivors, and they met after the war in a DP camp. But you can imagine that the generational trauma that's inflicted,
Mhm.
being a child of two survivors, and, you know, two immigrants that come to a land where they don't speak the language and have this huge burden that they carry, and to be a child growing up in assimilated America, as you know. So it was a different reaction from my mom. She understood the importance, but I don't think she wanted to go through the pain of what she endured as a child. And it was funny because, you know, just to touch upon what I just said, growing up, I really thought, because I grew up in a largely Jewish community, that everybody's grandparents had numbers tattooed on their arm, or were patients of Dr. Mengele, or, you know, I mean, they would get together, and as a child sitting around a table with my grandmother's friends, it was almost like who suffered more. And they would have these conversations, that talking about their stories, and you just kind of took it as normal because you didn't know anything else, and this was the world that you lived in. So you just thought, okay, this was their life a long time ago, and they're here, and they're better, and they're happy, and they spoil me and cook a lot.
Yeah,
But my
absolutely.
my grandmother's biggest concern was always that I wasn't being fed enough and that I was too skinny. And growing up, being at her house, if I didn't finish the food off my plate, she made sure that that food was finished. If she had to give me money to finish it, she would. So, you know, coming from that kind of upbringing, but she really embodied and encompassed, um, I think, like the prototype for what you think of the Eastern European booby, like someone out of a Shalom Aleichem novel, out of, you know, like Tevye, Eastern Europe. It was so interesting for me because both my grandparents lived in Brooklyn, but my father's side, they were American Jews born and raised in New York City, and they were very sophisticated and cultured and all these kind of things. And you know, my mother's side, they came from the shtetl, and they were Eastern European Jews, and a completely different way of life. even when they came here. My grandmother never drove a car. She never wanted to drive. The things that mattered to her were the simple things. She wasn't into anything materialistic. She wasn't into plastic surgery. She had all these wrinkles, as you see in the picture that you showed. It was funny because obviously she led a hard life, and I'm sure, the wrinkles are part of the story. But
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
it was just this interesting dichotomy with my other grandmother. Well, there are doctors that can do something for you. They can have surgeons, you could have a facelift. And she couldn't grasp what those things were because they weren't important to her. So she had a particular way of living, and she really instilled so much in terms of I think understanding how to live and what to be grateful for because of what she endured.
Wow. Not everybody could, but it's a great description. You mentioned it was at McGill University in a class called Eastern Orthodox Mysticism taught by Father Anthony Gabriel of the Greek Orthodox Church in Montreal, where you decided to write her story titled A Narrative as a Means to Combat Injustice. Take me back to that class and the journey of writing the paper, outlining her story.
McGill University was a very, very special place. I was a cultural studies major, which fell under Bachelor's of English. So I had a lot of flexibility within my major of the classes that I could take. And I decided to take this class, Eastern Orthodox Mysticism, because it sounded fun, and it was taught by a father from the Greek Orthodox Church who was this incredible, incredible man, Anthony Gabriel. And we had a project that we needed to do in that class. And the assignment was to basically write about something that was personal to you, something about yourself. And so I started what the catalyst was the story of my grandmother, being that I was a grandson of Holocaust survivors. And he read this short piece that I wrote, and he said, you should really do something with this. And McGill has an incredible Holocaust archive, and they have a very vibrant Jewish studies department. And he said that I will give you the flexibility to do a term paper and research this for the semester and really kind of flesh it out if it's something that you want to do, because I see the importance in this and in telling this story. So I agreed, and I embarked upon this incredible journey. So you talk about why you're in certain places for certain reasons. And what was so interesting, Montreal had a fairly large survivor community. For North America, New York and Montreal were kind of the hubs after the war for survivors for the US and for Canada. When the language laws came into Montreal, a lot of the English-speaking Jews fled Quebec. I think many of them feared, similar things could happen, and there was a big migration to Toronto. But many stayed. And when I started doing the paper, the woman who ran the Holocaust archive at McGill University, her name was Renata Zajman. You don't forget these names.
Yeah, and that's a great name.
She was a survivor herself, and she fought in the resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto. She was a teen at that time, and she was a really tough, tenacious woman. And I was in the archive doing research, going through the stacks, looking for books. And I had the draft of the paper, which I had left on the table while I was looking for the books. And I get back to the table, and this woman confronts me, like really confronts me. And she's angry. And I look at her, and she says, "Is this your paper?" I said, "Yeah, it's my paper." And I think I had quoted something in the paper about, 1933, Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany, I referred to him as a young man. And she said, you cannot write a paper and refer to him as a young man. She said, a monster, a devil, but he wasn't a young man. And, that kind of stuck with me. And then she said to me, come here. She said, I see your grandmother's from this town in Opatov. So she took it upon herself to read my draft. And she said, I had dinner last night with a man who's in Montreal from that town. And I want to introduce you to her, or introduce you to him. And I said, sure. And the next thing you know, I meet this man. She coordinates a meeting with us. We met at the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal. And this man not only had a book that was put together from the survivors of my grandmother's hometown with whatever remnants they had, because that town essentially disappeared. The Jews referred to Opatov as Apt, A-P-T, and that was kind of the Yiddish name for it. And they put together a book about a Jewish town that disappeared, and whatever photographs and stories that they had, they collected it. And, after the war, when everybody was in different countries, whether it was Israel or Brazil or Australia, the US, Canada, this book was there. And he gave me the book as part of my research. And as it turns out, he ended up knowing my great-grandfather, my great-grandfather. And my grandmother obviously was still alive at the time. And I told her about this, and they had connected and had mutual friends in common. And it was just wild. So you talk about the stars aligning, for lack of a better word. And this was the start of that journey. And that's kind of how it happened at McGill.
Had you started to speak out about injustices prior to that, or was this sort of that beginning road for you?
It was the beginning. It definitely was the beginning. I think, so much in college for me was this kind of understanding of self, this self-awakening. And there were certainly causes that I was passionate about. Jewish causes were really not one of them for me. I grew up secular. I was bar mitzvahed, and I didn't have such a great experience as a teen going through that process. I never really felt like I fit in. So after my bar mitzvah, I really kind of wanted to distance myself from my Judaism, in the sense that I didn't want to be really affiliated with anything religious. And when I went to McGill and I left New York, again, I realized that not everybody is Jewish. Not everybody comes from families of Holocaust survivors. Your story is unique. And then I connected with a Jewish community at McGill. I got involved with Hillel. I took a lot of Jewish studies departments. I met some of the most incredible professors there. And it really rekindled this sense and created a really positive experience about my cultural identity as a Jew, which I really never had before that. And couple that with also coming out in college, being in a city like Montreal, which is a very progressive, open-minded city, big gay community. I was also the social coordinator at Queer McGill at the time. So I was doing some activist stuff, more so related to sexuality at that time. But then this kind of aligned with it. And it was funny because when I came out to my parents in college, my father made this joke. He said, well, you're in college, and if it's not the Holocaust stuff that you're, writing on or researching, it's the gay stuff. So I had this juxtaposition of, Holocaust and gay, and that kind of defined my college experience. But again, that led me down the path for the work that I do. So I think certainly this was a defining moment in my young adult life.
Hmm. In the paper, you talk about that the Holocaust is perhaps more relevant today, and you were writing this in 1999, than it has ever been. Which, here we are in
Mhm.
2024. Why do you recall it being so important in 99? And talk about, you know, why you're joining me today in 2024 to continue this conversation.
Well, as you know, the world we are living in, I mean, just a precipitous rise in anti-Semitism all over the world, and which was happening prior to October 7th, and then October 7th hits, and it's, multiplied thousands of times. And now, for the first time, I feel in my life living in this country, I have some sense of what it must have felt like for
Mhm.
my grandparents to be Jews in a country where they were targeted, where they were excluded, or they had to be fearful about wearing a yarmulke if they were walking outside in public, or wearing a Star of David or a chai. And I never felt that. I never felt that growing up. And it really had, it's really since October 7th, and I think a lot of the events leading up to that, that we realize that anti-Semitism is real. You see these horrible tropes that just come back every few decades, and you think they've gone away and they haven't, or you're out in public and you overhear conversations and casual dining amongst friends, and people will say things and you're like, no, that's not okay. You can't say that. And so many people don't know. They don't kind of understand the scope of what happened. And unless we continue to tell these stories, unless we continue to bear witness, things won't change. And the hope is, look, I mean, we hope that things will change for the better, but again, there's no guarantee in that. So I think, our power is telling our stories and making sure that we claim that and we own that, and that the world understands what happened so that this doesn't happen again. And I think in 1999, what was going on was the fact that survivors were disappearing, and we were dealing with a time where time was running out. And obviously, as each year passes, fewer and fewer survivors remain. And there will come a day where there will be no more survivors. So it's people like you, Alan, the children of survivors, and people like me, the grandchildren, who will continue to carry that torch and carry that legacy with us.
Uh, you hit me again powerfully, because I realized, you say, 1999 they were dying off, and my father died January of 1999. It's yeah, it's I agree, and for me, it really was Charlottesville that lit a fire in me, and wanting to speak up, and thinking what my mother would have thought watching that unfold. And I can't imagine your grandmother watching that unfold. And then, if they were alive to see what happened on October 7th, I couldn't imagine
Terrible,
has
terrible.
felt, what that has felt like for any Holocaust survivor to have seen the events of October 7th.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, my grandmother was here for 9/11, and I remember the trauma of that
Oh,
and
wow.
the shock, of just witnessing a terrorist attack happening on American soil, and thinking, we came here because we didn't think this something like this would happen here. So I wouldn't even want to imagine
So
what
true.
she would have thought with October 7th. And, again, I mean, you talk about, there's certainly generational trauma. What happened on October 7th, all of those things, just kind of rise up, that, the horrors of what they went through are passed down. And when you see these images and these videos and hear these stories recounted about October 7th, it's mind-blowing. One of the hardest things for me when I did this paper was to just be able to comprehend the scope of what happened in the Holocaust, how 6 million Jews could perish off the face of this earth while a whole world watched. And you think of that number, you think of 6 million and what that took for a whole entire world, for an entire continent to stand by and effectively allow it to happen for years until something was done. And the scope of how it was orchestrated. You know, you just walk out in day-to-day life and you look at the people on the street that pass you and you think, God, you know, if this was Europe, these would be the people that could be turning you in to the Nazis. These are the people that, you know, could be driving the trains to take you to the camps, because everybody in some way was complicit. And sure, you know, there were righteous Gentiles and people that fought in the resistance and did their part. But again, for something like this to happen, the world watched. They just didn't disappear overnight. And the way in which they disappeared, you know, is just mind-blowing, that humanity that could do this.
Barbaric.
So, you know, it's almost hard to conceptualize, to grasp that something like this is a reality. And I think today, when people talk about the Holocaust, and now there's so much denial, and you start hearing, we just had Holocaust Remembrance Day, and you start reading reports of Holocaust denial. And, you know, I think it can almost be easy to deny it because it was so horrific that people could say, yeah, well, that didn't happen like that, or there's no way that that many people were killed. Well, the one thing that I can tell you was the Germans kept great records. And in doing the research that I did, it was remarkable to find all the documents that listed the dates of transports to the hour when they entered a camp, when they exited a camp. Everything was documented so meticulously. So to the Germans' credit, we have that as proof.
I posted something for international, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and there were people who responded saying it, never happened. Today, in 2024, it's horrifying. Take me back to, your grandmother, as you said, was born in Poland. She even experienced anti-Semitism prior to the war. You talk about in the paper. If you would share her story, in Poland.
Yeah, so she was born, her document said 1923, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But we believe that she was actually born in 1925. When she got taken by the Nazis, she knew that if she told them that she was too young, that she would be sent for extermination. So she wanted to be older, okay? And that way she could work. So something as simple as that saved her life.
Wow.
But she grew up in Poland in a small town called Opatów, which is still there. And they grew up in a shtetl. So, this was a largely Jewish community. They spoke Yiddish amongst their community. She did speak Polish, but she was told, when she was home and when she lived, within her house and in her village, that she was to speak Yiddish. She went to school. And when she went to school, that's where she encountered her first doses of anti-Semitism. She had to sit in the back of the room. Her teacher would, admonish her for being Jewish, would tell her she was responsible for killing Christ. And that was something that was always ingrained in her. Even to the day that she died, she had this thing, well, people hate me because I was always told that I killed Christ. And she would laugh. And she said, I didn't kill Christ. But I think there was so much that was deeply rooted in Polish culture where, the Jews were separate. Sure, they lived in Poland, but they really weren't considered Polish. They were Jews. They spoke this, different dialect that they had created. And they looked different, they dressed different, they had different customs. And that's really, where she had the first doses with anti-Semitism. And then obviously Hitler comes to power and laws get passed. And in the 30s, things started becoming more and more difficult for Jews, and things were being taken away up until the point that when the Nazis occupied Poland and took over Poland, she could not go to school anymore. So that ended. And it was shortly thereafter that the Nazis invaded, and the Nazis would come into her village. So ultimately, it was 1942, and they knew that the Nazis were going to be coming within the next few days. And she was fearful, and she wanted to try to escape. So she knew she had a brother in the city and that she was going to try to go see him. And she left. She left on foot, and she got picked up. She got caught in the forest by the Nazis, and they picked her up and they put her in an open air truck, and they sent her to a work camp, which would be the first camp of incarceration for her. And that was Skarżysko-Kamienna. And for those people who don't know, there were concentration camps, there were death camps, and there were also work camps. So if anyone had seen Schindler's List, they were in a work camp, which was a munitions factory. So the Germans needed the slave labor in the war effort to help them. So it wasn't necessarily always to their benefit to exterminate all the Jews. They wanted to take the strong ones and put them to work before they ultimately killed them. So she was incarcerated in this camp in 1942, and she was put to work making ammunitions. And largely what she would do is they would fill bullets and machinery for the Germans. There was a book that was written about Skarżysko-Kamienna called Death Comes in Yellow. And everything about that camp related to the powder that they were working with, which would dye their hands and their skin yellow. They would inhale this stuff, so it became very difficult. It would get on their clothing, and they would have to wash their clothes every night. And she would talk about having one dress and hanging it out to dry when she would come back from work. And they were in barracks, and she would have her dress stolen, and they would wake up and she would have no clothes, and they would get beaten just if they, felt like beating someone, or if someone, your clothes got stolen, well, you were going to get beaten for that. So she endured hell, but, in a certain way, the work camps were maybe slightly better than the concentration camps, because they knew that the hope was, as long as they worked, that they wouldn't be sent to the death chambers. So they would get a ration of food a day. My grandmother would say we didn't even know what the food was. It was just disgusting. And you ate what you did. They would walk them by. I guess they did a lineup every day where they would have to account for being present. and they would hang people in the middle of the camp. So they would leave those bodies hanging for days. So if somebody did something wrong, if someone tried to escape, they wanted that to serve as a reminder to them that this could be you. And I always asked my grandmother, you had all these years. I mean, she was born in the 20s, and then Hitler comes into power in the 30s, and he's in, neighboring Germany. But it really wasn't until the 40s, with the implementation of the final solution, where things really amped up, with deportations and mass extermination. And I said to my grandmother, I said, well, why didn't you try to escape? And her response was, where could we go? There was nowhere to escape to. At that point, these were not sophisticated people in Poland. These were people that led simple lives, very different from the German Jews, who were very much assimilated, who had wealth, who had power. The vast majority of Polish Jews were not that, right? They were, for lack of a better word, almost peasants in that way. So they didn't have the means to leave. If you look at the numbers, of the amount of Jews that were exterminated out of Poland versus Germany, many of the German Jews were able to get out, whether they went to, what would become Israel or to the United States. They had the financial resources. They were also, much, much more educated. So
And I think you said in the paper there were 3.5 million Jews before the war and 500,000 after.
Correct.
I mean, let that sink in.
Right. And in such a short period of time, right? You think about, really, it was a period of effectively in Poland, a couple of years that the exterminations took place en masse.
You mentioned that your grandmother would pray at night and sing a song. Do you remember some of the lyrics she shared?
Yeah. So, when you see Holocaust films and you read about the Holocaust, I think, art and music and poetry, right? You think of the Diary of Anne Frank and how, Anne tried to cope with what she was living with. So much of, I think, the will to survive came in hope, and hope for them, maybe came in song, or came in the ability to, if they had, an instrument, or they could recite poetry. And she always talked about songs that they sang in the camps. And I said to her, I said, well, what song? Can you tell me the lyrics? And she had this song that was called Where Shall I Go? And I was able to research that and found in the documentation, these were real songs. And what the lyrics translated to were, where shall I go? There is no answer for me. Where shall I go? Every door is closed for me. To the left and to the right, where shall I go?
Wow. She was liberated on January 5th, 1945, but had left the camp you were talking about prior to that, right? In August of 44?
Right. Yeah. They knew they were losing the war. So I would say, the Germans realized towards, getting closer towards 1945 that they weren't going to win the war, and that they needed, the one thing that they really wanted to accomplish was their goal of at least making Europe, right, Judum free of Jews. So you had the closing of camps, which led to the mass deportations to Auschwitz and the other death camps. You also had the death marches. So she, in 1944, as the Russians were coming closer, they started closing camps that they felt may become under Russian territory. So she got transferred to a camp called Częstochowa, which I believe was probably about 70 miles or so from Skarżysko. So she was there, again from 44. I think she got in August 1944, and then until liberation in 1945. And it was, again, a similar camp to Skarżysko, but the Russians ultimately were the ones that liberated her. And she always talked about that in the middle of the night, she heard bombings and these loud noises. And she said one night it was as if a bomb had landed in their camp, and it was the Russians that came in. So she always had this kind of, because the Russians liberated her, this feeling where she what's the word that I would use? I don't want to say that she had not a soft spot, but
Sort of revered them to some degree because they rescued her, right?
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that. And it was there then after liberation that she had to embark on the next part of her journey, which was now trying to put the pieces of her life back together. And it wasn't as if the war ended and everything, was
Right.
kumbaya, right? Her life in the months that followed liberation were probably equally, if not more dangerous than her life in the camp, because now she had to go back to her hometown without any assistance, try to find any survivors of her
Well, first, find your way back.
find your way back, right?
Yeah.
Right.
You said it
Figure it
was about 70 miles away from, right?
Right. So yeah, Częstochowa was 70 miles from the other camp. It was 124 miles from Warsaw. So
Wow.
she had to then journey back and figure out how to get back on foot to her hometown and try to find the pieces of her life and see if there were any remaining survivors. So she goes back to Opatov, and she said the town is literally in rubble, with the exception of one house that was standing. And she went back to her house, and she literally saw rubble of where the doorstep was. And a neighbor's house was still standing, and there was a Polish woman living in the house, and the woman remembered her, and she said, "Oh, you're still alive." And the one thing that she would recount was, in the days and the weeks after liberation, they had no food. Everything was on rations if there was food, and they had to break into farms. She recounted a story of walking back and finding a chicken farm and going into that farm and chasing after the chicken to kill it so that they would have something to eat. And at the same time, then being found by whoever was in charge of that place, coming out threatening to kill them. And again, there was just so much craziness that was going on with, the end of the occupation and the Russians coming in on one side and the Americans on the other side, that it was kind of a free-for-all, and people were still killing Jews. So, she was very much at risk. And she goes back to her hometown, and everyone died. Her entire family, mother, father, brothers, sisters. She was the only survivor.
7 siblings, correct?
7 siblings, the only
I
survivor.
mean, just surviving, surviving the camps is one thing, but for somebody at her young age to come back and learn both, for all of the survivors who had to endure that realization that there was no one left to return to. Uh, you know, the fact that your grandmother lived to 80 and the way you describe her is a testament to the will of these survivors.
Yeah. And had she not gone that one day earlier, had she not gone to try to escape her village, she would have perished. And they came to find out that the majority of them went straight to Auschwitz, never saw the light of day. Um, so it was at that point then that ultimately she leaves Opatov and she goes to one of the larger cities in Poland called Lodz. And she lives with a girl that she meets and she tells her, I'll cook, I'll clean. And they had agencies that were being set up. And the agency that really helped my grandmother was an agency called Joint, Joint. It still exists to this day. And they also had DP camps set up. So DP stands for displaced persons. So this was the place where Jews would go to basically start getting assistance with helping to figure out where they were going to go, how they were going to piece together their lives. So while she's in Lodz, she meets my grandfather, who was also a survivor. As it turned out, he was in the last camp that she was in, Częstochowa, but he wasn't liberated by the Russians. They sent him on the death march, and he went to Buchenwald to get exterminated right before the camp got liberated. So he ended up being in Buchenwald, and then from Buchenwald they had the final death march, which he survived. And my grandfather had been married and had a son before the war, and he was significantly older than my grandmother. This picture behind me, this side, you can
Mm-hmm.
see that's my grandmother and my grandfather with my uncle, who was born in Germany. But he was quite a bit older than her, and his wife and son were murdered in front of his eyes when they were brought to the Lodz ghetto. And they were taken, and he went, when he was separated from his son and wife, he went to try to get his son out of wherever they were bringing him. And they caught him. He got his son, and they caught him fleeing. And the Nazis went to his son, shot him, his wife, shot her right in front of his eyes, and he begged them to kill him. And the Nazi laughed at him and said, "You're strong, you can work." So they sent him to the camps, and he worked. But you could just imagine, again, what people trying to cling on and find a way to forge a path forward. And she found this man, and they courted, I guess, for 3 weeks, and she marries him. And then they realized Poland was becoming an Iron Curtain. You couldn't stay. You had to leave.
Mm-hmm.
So they end up leaving Poland and going through Austria, ultimately into Germany from 1945 until 1950. They lived outside of Munich, and they were in several DP camps, and they were trying to get immigration because now we have to figure out where you're going to go. Initially, prior to meeting my grandfather, my grandmother was going to go to an orphanage in Paris, and that was going to be the plan. And then she met my grandfather, and that all changed. So they had decisions to make, and it wasn't easy to just get immigration to countries.
Right.
So what was interesting was my grandfather had a sister who survived Auschwitz. And very shortly after the war, there was an aunt in San Jose, Costa Rica, who was able to get her over to Costa Rica. So Luba, who was my grandfather's sister, went first and said to the siblings, I'm going to secure papers for you. So she got papers, which I have documents of, for my grandfather and my grandmother and for his brother to come to Costa Rica. So we were all supposed to go to Costa Rica. However, my grandfather was like, what Jews are going to Costa Rica? Because Costa Rica at that point had a minuscule Jewish population. He didn't know anything about this country. So his ideal was, I want to go to America. That's where everyone's going, or most people. He also could have gone to Israel. But he made a conscious decision. He didn't want to go to Israel. You know what the reason was for him not wanting to go to Israel? He was always very clear on that. He said, we don't want to see more war. I saw enough war in my lifetime. He knew that by going to Israel, he would have to fight for the creation of the Israeli state, and that his life would ultimately result in more war. And he knew he couldn't endure any more of that. So America was where he wanted to go because he felt that they would be safest there and they would have the best opportunity. So right before they were going to go to Costa Rica, he got approved to work on a farm in Altoona, Pennsylvania. So they booked passage and they came by boat. And he never went to that farm. He met a friend and they said, we're going to stay here in Brooklyn. And that's where they settled. And they never left. Wow. So they literally started over and arrived here with the shirt on their backs.
You know, in reading the narrative, you asked your grandmother a question that you say lingered in your mind the entire time she was telling you her ordeal. And the question was, what happened to your belief in God and religion during the Holocaust? How did she answer that?
Yeah, I think for her, obviously, she always had faith, but that faith, I think, was tested during the Holocaust, and it became really hard. She would always say that, I thought he forgot about us, that we were forgotten. You know, in Judaism, they always talk that we're waiting for the Moshiach, or the Messiah, to come back, right? And she said, where's the Messiah? He needs to come now. We need to be saved. And he never came. So I think as far as her faith was concerned, she struggled with that. But ultimately, over time, I think it was her faith that would get her through, and her tradition, and her sense that there was hope, and that she could rebuild life again, and that slowly, from liberation to her new life in America, starting in 1950, and having her 2 children and then her grandchildren, she was able to restore that faith in her religion and instill that faith in her children and her grandchildren, that this is a part of who we are, and this is something that we need to carry on. And that's something that, you know, she always lit the Shabbos candles, every Shabbos. She always kept all the traditions. And it really, I think, gave her the ability to carry on. But the one thing about my grandmother, and in all the sadness of this story, and these stories are so sad, and anyone who's a survivor or child or relative of a survivor knows, It's like one story is worse than the other. But I didn't know a woman who dwelled in the misery of what she endured. Because the one thing that I think when you endure something like that, it's so easy to be miserable with life and to be jaded. But that wasn't who she was. She was a woman who laughed, who smiled, who could teach you the most incredible things about life, about cooking, about family. She just had an incredible joy in living, and she was able to instill that in her kids. It was, you ever watch the movie Mr. Saturday Night with Billy Crystal?
A long time ago, but yeah.
There's a scene in that movie where I think it's either his mother or his grandmother or his aunt, and he always laughs, that she had these big arms, and she would put her arms out and all the skin would hang under the arm, and that always resonated with me because she always cooked. She was overweight and she had all these wrinkles, but she laughed, and she would always hug you, and there was something about her touch. She had this incredible touch, and the way that she would put her hand on you, it was almost as if it were healing. So she really wasn't bitter at life. I think if anything, she took that bitterness and she turned that into her joy because she saw what she was able to create in her life. And I think so much of what she gave me was the ability to stand up for injustice and to stand up for the little guy and to know this happened once before. This could happen again. So it's up to us to be the people who will fight against injustice, who will call things out when we see things are wrong. And that's why I feel I do the work that I do, because it's just something that's almost innate within me to want to try to make the world a better place. But we have a lot of work to do in this world.
We really do. I spoke at Fairleigh Dickinson about I shared my mother's story at Fairleigh Dickinson, which is my alma mater. And somebody asked me, what do I think my parents would think of me being up in front of the room sharing her story? And I said, first, they'd be shocked and surprised because I didn't fully grasp it while they were both alive. I knew they were Holocaust survivors, but I said they would be very proud. And, we do have to speak up. I mean, we can't sit and watch, misinformation, hatred, murder. It's it's just not, the fact that 11 lives were risked to save my life. I would not be here if not for those two parents who risked their 9 children to save my mother and her mother. You and I wouldn't be having this conversation if
Right.
those, righteous folks did not hide them and take them in for 2 years and save their lives. That's the least I could do is speak up, and the least you and I can do for what our families had to endure for both of us to be here.
100%. And that's what I felt in doing in telling this story. I said, well, if we don't document it, who's going to document it? Who's going to tell this story? We can't leave that to somebody else to interpret. This is our history, and we need to be able to own that and be able to share that, because society and history, the hope is that we learn from it.
Right. 79 years ago, they said never again. And October 7th sadly proved that wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's quite devastating. I don't know what the answers are in terms of, moving forward where we are. I wish I had the answers, because there's so much sadness right now in this world. You feel like you're a target again. I just saw Prayer for the French Republic on Broadway, which deals with modern day anti-Semitism in Paris, and a family trying to confront the issue of whether or not to make Aliyah, to go to Israel as Jews, because they see kind of the foreboding rise of the far right returning to France, and how, having lived with the trauma of what we've lived with, I feel as Jews, or at least children of survivors, we always have a passport ready when stuff starts getting ugly. We're always ready to pack up, and where are we going to go now? And I think it's important for people to understand, when people talk about Zionism, and they talk about it today like it's this dirty word somehow. And, the necessity for the state of Israel to exist for our survival is something that is really important, because the one thing that I can tell you as a child of survivors, never again does mean never again. And then, history has repeated itself for
Hmm.
thousands of years, and we have never had a home where we can be safe. And Israel is that for Jews. So ultimately, we have to figure out a way where we can move forward, and that people can live together in peace and work together. Because I can't tell you what the solutions are, but what I can tell you is nobody's going to be disappearing. Jews aren't going to disappear. Palestinians aren't going to disappear. So, somehow we're going to have to look towards the future and figure out a way how we can coexist for the security of our people, as well as the security of all people, to be
Correct.
free and to be able to live a life in dignity, where they don't have to worry about being exterminated or being expelled from their country because of their religion.
Amen to that, Jeremy. That's a perfect way to end this conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you, Alan. I really appreciate you allowing space for these stories to be told, and seeing the importance in sharing these stories, so that these testimonies can live on out there, in the internet.
Well, we need to, you and I need to continue to do so. If there's anything I can ever do to help, please, you know, let's do it together.
Absolutely. And it's something that, our film festival strives to do, is to always continue to tell stories of all marginalized groups. Because again, there's that thread, that we are not the only ones who have suffered genocide and oppression. So I think it's essential that we tell all the stories that need to be told, because at the end of the day, we're all human, and we have to share
And
this
we
world
all
together.
bleed red.
Yeah.
We're all one and the same, you know.
Yep. And we're not taking it with us. So the sooner that we can learn that, and the sooner that we can start realizing that we really do have more in common than what divides us, we can make a difference. And it is my hope that we will find a way forward, and that humanity will rise above the horrors of the Holocaust.
And you and I both agree, nobody wants to see innocent lives taken in the name of religion, war, and we need those hostages to come home.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Alan. Appreciate your conversation tonight.
Same here, really. And let's stay in touch.
Absolutely.
Have a great night. Thanks, everybody. Thank you to Jeremy Lentz for taking the time to share his grandmother's story and for making sure we never forget what happened during World War II to the 6 million Jews. As I leave you tonight, remember, we all have choices to make in life. Speak up, do the hard things, and let's all fight hate for good. I truly believe conversations like this can change the world around us. Feel free to share these episodes with your friends and family. And until the next conversation, please, please stay safe.